The German retreat on October 27th gave the Allies the hope that a breakthrough was near. Operation Suitcase kicked off exactly 1 week ago, and the Allied forces in this sector were getting exhausted without having much to show for it. Yes, they had pushed the Germans back and exhausted the German forces considerably, but the Germans were still holding a more or less coherent front line. The goal to destroy the German 15th Army south of the Meuse was at this stage just wishful thinking. The Germans had orders to hold the line in Brabant coming all the way from Gerd von Rundstedt, the supreme commander of the Western Front. Hitler needed time to amass men and equipment for his Ardennes offensive, and the German army in Brabant had to prolong their resistance with its depleted divisions for that reason. The German positions over there were tying up 9 Allied divisions, including 3 armored divisions, which would otherwise be deployed for an attack into Germany. Every day they were in Brabant was a day gained to equip and train the assault divisions for the Ardennes offensive. The German army dutifully prepared for the next attack. Their defensive line was anchored at 2 pivots, Bergen-op-Zoom and Roosendaal, where they could shelter behind constructed anti-tank ditches and concrete obstacles. There they had put their best units, the 2 battalions of the 6th Parachute Regiment. In the middle of this line they had posted their 2 assault gun units around the village of Wouw, where they apparently expected an armored thrust. They correctly assessed that the open terrain over there would favor armor and mechanized forces, and had prepared accordingly. In the Allied camp, the battle plans were also being drawn. The Canadian 4th Armored Division would focus on the attack north of Bergen-op-Zoom, while the British 49th Division would focus on the Rosendaal area. Meanwhile, in the middle, the British 34th Armored Brigade, also known as Clark Force, would try to push towards Wouw to tie down the German armor. The attack on the Rosendaal area was divided into 2 axes. The 147th Brigade would attack the city head-on, while the 146th Brigade would try to skirt around Rosendaal and move towards Kruisland. But this was easier said than done. If we look closer at the defense of Rosendaal, it becomes clear that the city was shielded by both sides by natural water barriers on a north-south axis. In the south, the main defense was a tank ditch running from west to east. These positions stretched out for at least 4 kilometers, but the German units in the region were so depleted that they had not enough manpower to actually defend a continuous front line. The 857th Regiment had only a few hundred men left, so they could only set up roadblocks on the main roads with several dozen men each. This was not enough to delay a full-blown attack, let alone stop it. That's why the presence of the 2nd Battalion of the 6th Parachute Regiment changed the entire dynamic of the German defense of Rosendaal, as we shall see. Although this battalion was also down to at most 100 men, these were by now experienced and motivated assault troops, led by a cadre of even more experienced officers. These troops would be the backbone of the local defense in the face of the imminent British attack. On October 28th, the British attack on Rosendaal defense began. In the early morning, the Duke of Wellington's regiment arrived in Tolberg, where it was broken up in companies, with the exploitation phase of their advance. The C Company went west, the D Company went east, while the A Company went north. Just after 11 o'clock, A Company managed to cross the tank ditch in an undefended sector. This minor incursion had to be pushed back, and a heavily reduced company of about 30 Fallschirmjäger set out to do the job. The British called in artillery to break up the German attack, but the Germans pressed on regardless, and by the middle of the afternoon the British evacuated their vanguard across the tank ditch. Meanwhile, the town of Rosendaal was buzzing with rumors. The sound of this fierce battle raised expectations that the British were advancing, and the Germans in the town were visibly nervous. Soldiers were preparing imminent evacuation, and people were warned of the demolition of a bridge with explosives. The Canadians had entered Bergen-op-Zoom the day before, so Rosendaal expected to be liberated any moment. The British also had high hopes to breach the German defences and enter the town that day, because at the end of the afternoon A Company again crossed the tank ditch. They surprised the Germans on the other side, who had expected that the British would stick to their usual office hours and would cease operations after 5 o'clock. The Germans in turn decided to surprise the British under cover of night to launch an attack by a patrol, which was beaten off. This was just the beginning, because before dawn the Germans had brought their best company forward to launch an attack with the support of an assault gun. Within a half hour the British were driven back over the tank ditch. The British were partly overrun and almost 20 prisoners of war were taken. These were paraded through the town centre of Rosendaal by the Germans. The British were undeterred by this loss and redoubled their effort. Now the whole Duke of Wellington's regiment was rallied to get over the tank ditch. The Germans also upped the stakes, and soon Mager's battalion was completely deployed to defend this sector. The British were however so determined to take Rosendaal that they threw in the Royal Leicestershire Regiment as well. This battalion was supported by tanks and mobile anti-tank guns and attacked in the late afternoon. This was too much pressure to bear for the depleted German Parachute battalion, and by the end of the afternoon they started to fall back, first behind the railway embankment and later behind the Sportstraat. While the British were battling for Roosendaal, the Canadians tried to overcome the Fallschirmjäger in Bergen-op-Zoom. The bulk of the 6th Parachute Regiment was located behind the Zoom, the stream which gave the town Bergen-op-Zoom its name. The water barrier was not very wide, but its embankments were steep. This deep moat made it very difficult to simply cross and lay a bridge. The bridging could not be undertaken without the clearing of the north bank by the infantry. The German paratroopers were meanwhile very thinly spread out among the zone. The 3rd Battalion could spare 2 depleted companies to hold the sector between the estuary and the small industrial area in the east. In that area was an alcohol factory to produce fuel. The young paratroopers had no idea of the purpose of the abandoned alcohol and decided to drink it, with fatal consequences. There was also good news. The 10th Company got a batch of Sturmgewehr 44, which greatly increased their firepower, just in time to counter the Canadian efforts to cross the zone. In the afternoon of October 28th, the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders crossed the zone but were driven off by the fire of the German 9th Company. In the evening they tried again in vain. In the late evening the Canadians decided to split the German forces by attacking in 2 places at the same time. The Lincoln and Welland Regiment attacked around the industrial area, while the Argyll and Sutherland Highland Regiment crossed the zone near a forest. These attempts all failed, but during the night the Lincoln and Welland Regiment made 2 more attempts, which were both repulsed. The Canadians were frantically trying to get over the zone, and in the early morning of the 29th the attacks were resumed. By then the Canadians knew that the Germans had no continuous front line and were exhausted by the night fighting. It was a matter of time before a weak spot would be found. Under the cover of darkness, D Company of the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders moved down to the estuary of the Zoom and crossed there. By 11 o'clock a firm bridgehead was established by D Company. Meanwhile the Canadians applied pressure along the whole front to prevent the Germans from moving troops from one sector to the other. This pressure allowed the D Company of the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders to break out of the bridgehead and roll up the German defences along the zone. The German 10th Company tried to salvage the situation with a counter-attack to throw the Canadians back, but this failed. The clearing of the north bank of the zone by the Canadians had by then become just a matter of time. The German paratroopers took their loss and decided to retreat to the north. As we can see on the larger map, There were hardly any obstacles north of Bergen-op-Zoom. It was perfect tank terrain and the Canadian 4th Armored Brigade was in the process of breaking out, threatening to cut off the German retreat. If it was not cut off, the depleted German 6th Parachute Regiment was about to be overrun by the pursuing Canadian 10th Brigade. Nothing could save the German paratroopers but a miracle. The Canadian 4th Armored Division was however also exhausted due to the continuous fighting since the start of Operation Suitcase 10 days earlier. The divisional medical officer ordered a mandatory 48 hours rest and this inadvertently saved the German paratroopers from being routed. The Germans must have been amazed of the sudden halt of their pursuers, but happily took the opportunity to escape and fight another day. The 6th Parachute Regiment would make a final stand around Steenbergen.